My name is Allison Hayes. I am 29 years old. And the day my grandfather's will was read, my parents looked me in the eye and tried to erase me. We were in our Garden District mansion, sitting at a long, polished table. My knuckles were white as my sister, Haley, smiled in her designer dress, already acting like she owned the room. My mother announced Haley would receive $25 million. My father slid the papers over, and everyone murmured their congratulations. Then he looked at me and shrugged. He said Haley gets the $25 million, but I get nothing. He told me I could earn my own because Grandpa was done with me for choosing my career over family. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? Let me know your story down in the comments. I would love to know who is part of our community. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a single tear. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. As I sat at that long, polished table in the Garden District, I realized I had been the silent investor in their version of a family for 22 years, and today, they had simply decided to liquidate my shares. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. Haley sat across from me, her smile as artificial as the fast fashion brands she promoted to her 3 million followers. To my parents, Haley was the golden child, a walking billboard for the Hayes name. Every time she wanted a new designer bag or a first-class flight to a photo shoot, the family vault opened without a word. My parents, Tiffany and Jeffrey, called it investing in her brand. I called it what it was, a subscription I was forced to co-sign with my own exclusion. For 22 years, I had lived in the shadow of her likes. While Haley was being handed everything on a silver platter, I was working 3 jobs just to keep my head above water in architecture school. I worked as a waitress, a library assistant, and a night janitor, scrubbing floors, while Haley was sipping champagne at gallery openings. When I had asked for help with my final year of tuition, just $12,000, my father laughed and told me to be realistic. Architecture is a hobby, Allison, my mother had said, her voice dripping with that familiar condescension. Green walls and sustainable urban design are just expensive moss for people with too much time. If you want a future, follow Haley's lead. At least she knows how to be useful to our image. They told me to earn my own way because they believed I would fail. They thought that by starving me of their support, I would eventually come crawling back, willing to play the role of Haley's invisible assistant, just to have a roof over my head. They didn't realize that my compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for years, and the account was now officially closed. As the lawyer, Derek, looked at the papers my parents had provided, the ones that gave everything to Haley, I felt a wave of ice-cold clarity. My parents weren't just favoring a child. They were trying to rewrite history to erase the one person who actually cared for Grandpa John when the cameras weren't rolling. They had spent years using his name to build their status, while I spent my weekends in his dusty garden, listening to stories about the land and the trees.
He saw patterns they missed.
He saw that I wasn't the disappointment they claimed I was. I looked at my mother, who was already discussing renovations for the Garden District mansion with Haley. They were acting like I was already gone. But I knew something they didn't. I knew that the trash they claimed I was chasing was about to become the very thing that would leave them with nothing but their own vanity to keep them warm. Just as my mother started mentally rearranging the furniture in my childhood bedroom, Derek cleared his throat. It was a sharp, clinical sound that cut through their celebration, like a scalpel. He didn't look at the $25 million check on the table. He didn't look at Haley's smug expression. He looked directly at me with a level of professional respect my parents hadn't shown me in 2 decades. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was heavily wax-sealed with my grandfather John's private signet ring. The room went silent. My mother's face transitioned from a victory flush to bone white in under 3 seconds. "What is that?" she snapped, her voice losing its sweetness. "We've finished. The main assets have been distributed. There is nothing else." Derek didn't even blink. "This is a codicil," he said, his voice as heavy as a closing door. It was signed, notarized, and witnessed 6 months ago, with a full medical clearance stating Mr. John was of sound mind and memory. He gave me explicit instructions that this was to be opened only after the primary will was read, and specifically, only if Allison was present. I sat perfectly still. I didn't feel a rush of hope. I felt the cold hum of a machine finally clicking into gear. This wasn't a miracle. This was a calculated exit strategy. My parents had always wondered why I took their insults with such quiet dignity. They thought my silence was an admission of defeat. They thought they had finally broken me. But they didn't understand the invisible chain of the survivor. Most people think that being a victim means crying out or running away, but for someone like me, it means becoming a ghost in your own home. For years, I had been living in a house of mirrors where every exit led back to a parent telling me I was worthless. I had learned to treat my emotions like a frozen asset. You don't scream when you realize that silence is the only thing that keeps you safe. I wasn't being passive for all those years. I was simply waiting for the structural integrity of their lies to finally rot, so I could walk right through the walls. While Tiffany and Jeffrey were busy managing Grandpa's joint accounts to fund Haley's five-star lifestyle and her designer wardrobe, I was the one in the trenches. Every weekend for 3 years, I was at his house in the Garden District. I was the one who cleaned his reading glasses, adjusted his oxygen tank, and sat with him through the humid New Orleans nights. My parents had told him I was too busy with my useless architecture projects to visit. They told me he was too confused to recognize me. It was a classic hostile takeover of a human relationship. They had tried to liquidate my connection to the only man who ever believed in me, all while they were busy siphoning off his wealth. They saw an aging man as a declining stock. I saw him as a mentor who knew that my designs for sustainable cities weren't expensive moss. They were a legacy. Derek broke the seal. The sound of the paper tearing was the loudest thing in a room. To my granddaughter, Allison. He began reading. My father tried to stand up, his face reddening. This is ridiculous. He was old. He didn't know what he was doing. Derek's eyes remained like ice. Sit down, Jeffrey. You've had your turn at the table. Now listen to the real terms of this agreement. Derek read the words Grandpa John had written, with lethal precision. The room felt like it was losing oxygen as the silence of the Garden District mansion became a vacuum. I have observed, the codicil stated, the way my granddaughter Allison has been treated as a liability by those who should have been her protectors. I have seen the way her messages were deleted from my phone and how my calls to her were blocked. My mother's face twisted. It wasn't just anger, it was the panic of a cornered predator. That is a lie, she screamed, her hand slamming against the polished mahogany so hard the crystal glasses rattled. He was hallucinating. Allison manipulated him. She whispered poison into his ear while we were busy maintaining the family's prestige. Jeffrey joined in, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. You've always been the difficult one, Allison. So ungrateful. We gave you a home, and now you've somehow managed to forge a document to steal what rightfully belongs to your sister. They weren't shocked by what they had done. They were shocked that the person they had spent years diminishing had finally stopped playing the role of the victim. They couldn't understand that I wasn't fighting for a check. I was conducting a forensic audit of their souls. This was the trap of normalizing cruelty. For over 2 decades, my parents had refined the art of treating me like an afterthought. It was a gradual erosion, starting with small dismissals and ending with systematic exclusion. They had practiced their disdain so long that it had become their only truth. In their minds, they weren't being evil. They were simply managing a problematic asset. They had convinced themselves that I didn't need the family resources because I was too stubbornly independent, a label they used to justify their own neglect. It was a psychological shell game they played to keep their own guilt at zero while they siphoned off my future to fund Haley's vanity. Haley didn't wait for the legal team to finish. She pulled out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen with practice speed. Within seconds, a notification pinged on my own device. She had posted a story to her 3 million followers. It was a tearful photo of her holding Grandpa John's hand, with a caption claiming that a greedy, estranged family member was trying to exploit a dying man's confusion. The comments were already flooding in. Thousands of strangers calling me a monster, a gold digger, a parasite. Haley looked up at me, her eyes dry and predatory. The world knows who you are now, Allison. You can have your fake papers. I have the truth. My followers won't let you get away with this. My mother nodded, a cold, satisfied smile returning to her lips despite her previous panic. You might have a lawyer, but we have the narrative. No one in New Orleans will ever hire an architect who steals from her own dying grandfather. I didn't blink. I didn't defend myself. Anger wasn't loud, it was analytical. I just watched them. They thought they were winning the war of perception. They didn't realize that in my world, foundations are built on solid ground, not on the shifting sands of social media. I watched Haley's screen glow with the self-righteous anger of 1,000 trolls. To her, a fact was only as real as its engagement rate. But I wasn't playing the game of perception anymore. I was playing the game of ownership. I didn't answer a single comment. I didn't defend my character to a mob of strangers. I simply looked at Derek and gave him a slight nod. It was time to move from family drama to a hostile takeover. Derek, I said, my voice clinical and devoid of the tremors they expected. Please explain the current valuation of the assets held under my name. Not the ones in the joint family trust, but the specific portfolio Grandpa John and I built over the last 7 years. My father scoffed, leaning back with a smirk. Assets? You mean that little Greenwall startup? The one we refused to fund because it was a sinkhole for tree huggers. Allison, that company isn't worth the paper its business plan is printed on. Derek didn't smile. He opened a different folder, one bound in heavy black leather. Actually, Jeffrey, we aren't talking about the architecture firm. We are talking about Project Urban Oxygen. He pulled out a map of New Orleans and several other major cities in the South. Overlaid on the maps were dozens of red zones, abandoned industrial lots, contaminated dead zones, and forgotten marshlands that had been considered liabilities for decades. Mr. John Hayes didn't just run a hardware store, Derek continued, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. He was a strategic land surveyor. Over the last 10 years, acting on the environmental data and architectural projections provided by Allison, he quietly purchased over 400 acres of these useless properties. He bought them for pennies because everyone else, including you, Jeffrey, saw them as trash. I watched my father's smirk begin to fray at the edges. My mother, Tiffany, looked confused. So what? He bought a bunch of dirt and scrap metal. Haley has $25 million in liquid cash. Actual money. That dirt, I said, leaning forward until I was inches from my mother's face, is currently the primary infrastructure for the new federal carbon credit initiative. Because of the regenerative green systems I designed and implemented on those lots, they are no longer liabilities. They are the most valuable carbon sinks in the region. As of yesterday, the controlling interest in Urban Oxygen, which I own entirely, is valued at $3 billion. The silence that followed was absolute. Haley's phone slipped from her hand, landing on the thick rug with a soft thud. The 3 million followers she was so proud of didn't matter in a room where the stakes had just shifted from influence to empire. 3 billion. Jeffrey whispered, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. That's impossible. Dad wouldn't have, he would have told me. He tried. I said, my tone as flat as a balance sheet. But you were too busy discussing Haley's engagement party. You told him his ideas were old man ramblings. You were so focused on the $25 million you could see today that you missed the billions we were growing for tomorrow. You didn't just exclude me from the family, Jeffrey. You excluded yourselves from the future. I opened my own laptop and turned it toward them. It wasn't a social media feed. It was a real-time display of the Urban Oxygen contracts. Companies were bidding millions just to lease the air rights over our land. I watched my parents' eyes scan the numbers. Numbers that made Haley's inheritance look like a rounding error. They weren't shocked by my betrayal. They were paralyzed by the realization that their version of family had been a bad investment, and I was the only one with the power to bail them out. Derek didn't let the silence linger. He reached back into his briefcase, but this time, he didn't pull out a spreadsheet or a deed. He produced a small digital recorder. Wealth is one thing, Jeffrey. Derek said, his voice dropping an octave until it vibrated in the room's vacuum. But the law cares about how that wealth is managed. And more importantly, how the person behind it is protected. My father was still staring at the $3 billion valuation on the laptop screen, his mind probably trying to find a way to claim a stake. But Derek pressed a button on the recorder. The audio was clear. It was from 2 months before Grandpa John passed away. My mother's voice came through first, sharp and devoid of the sweetness she used for her public image. "The creditors are calling again, Jeffrey," she said on the tape. "We need the marshland assets liquidated now. If he won't sign them over, we'll make him unable to refuse." Then my father's voice, tired but desperate. "He's stubborn. He thinks Allison is building something important out there. He won't sell." "Then we don't ask him," my mother hissed. "Dr. Sterling is already on board for 5% of the sale. He's drafting a certificate of mental incompetence today. Once we file it, John becomes a ward of the state under our guardianship. We sell the land, pay off the debts, and John spends the rest of his days in a facility where he won't be a distraction anymore." The recording stopped. The Garden District mansion, once a symbol of prestige, now felt like a crime scene. I looked at my parents. They weren't just toxic. They were predators who had tried to harvest their own father like a crop. This was the lethal discovery, the deep twist that redefined their crime from cruelty to fraud. I rubbed my eyes trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. They had fallen into the trap of the empty wallet. To people like Tiffany and Jeffrey, power was an illusion maintained by the balance in their checking accounts. They believed that as long as they had the appearance of wealth, they had the right to rule. But when the debt began to mount, they didn't turn to character or hard work. They turned to theft. They had spent so long normalizing their cruelty toward me that they eventually saw it as a legitimate business strategy to apply to everyone else. "That is a forgery," my father whispered, though his eyes were darting toward the exit. "It's a verified recording, Jeffrey," Derek countered, placing a set of medical records on the table, along with the fake certificate Dr. Sterling attempted to file. "The district attorney has already been briefed. This isn't a family dispute anymore. It is a criminal conspiracy to defraud an elder." I didn't feel pity. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for years, and now, the bill was due in full. This was the kill shot. It removed any remaining path to redemption for them, because they weren't just ungrateful, they were criminals. I sat in my new office, the headquarters of Urban Oxygen, looking out over the city of New Orleans. For the first time in my life, I wasn't looking at a skyline that made me feel small. I was looking at a landscape I had helped heal. The air in the room felt clean, devoid of the suffocating weight of my parents' expectations. The door swung open without a knock. It was my mother, Tiffany. She didn't look like the woman who had stood at the garden party with $25 million in her pocket. Her hair was disheveled, her designer suit was wrinkled, and her eyes were red and hollow. The mask of sweetness had been torn away, leaving only the raw, jagged edges of desperation. She stood there, trembling, clutching an expensive leather bag that had once been a symbol of her rank. Now, it was just a relic of a life that was falling apart. "Allison," she whispered, her voice cracking as if she hadn't spoken in days. "You have to do something. You have to help us. Haley is being boycotted by every brand she ever worked with. They are calling her a reputational risk. They are suing her for breach of contract. We are being evicted from the Garden District mansion, and Jeffrey's accounts have been frozen. We have nothing left." I didn't stand up. I didn't offer her a chair. I simply watched her with the analytical detachment of a forensic auditor. This was the peak of the transition. For 29 years, she had been the judge, and I had been the prisoner. Now, the roles had reversed, and she was the one awaiting sentencing. As I looked at her, I finally understood the trap she had built for herself. This was the illusion of power from an empty wallet. To people like Tiffany and Jeffrey, power was never a trait of character. It was a rented costume. They believed that as long as they had the appearance of wealth, they had the divine right to dictate the worth of everyone else. But when the debt finally came due and the wallet was emptied, They realized there was nothing inside the costume. They had spent so much time siphoning off the future of others that they never bothered to build a foundation of their own. They were fragile because they were hollow. Without a bank balance to give them gravity, they were just two predators who had been outplayed by the person they had dismissed as an afterthought. "I already took care of it, Tiffany," I said. My voice was cold, methodical, and as final as a closing door. I didn't yell. I didn't need to. I simply pushed a single, crisp document across the mahogany desk. She grabbed it with shaking hands, her eyes darting across the text. It wasn't a check for $25 million. It wasn't an agreement to bail out Haley's failing career. It was a formal receipt for a massive charitable contribution. You gave it away?" she gasped, looking at me with pure horror. "I donated exactly $2,300,000 to the National Center on Elder Abuse," I told her, my tone clinical. "It is the exact amount you and Jeffrey embezzled from Grandpa John's joint accounts over the last 4 years. I have already returned what you stole to the people you tried to silence. I have turned your greed into a legacy of protection. That is the only kindness you will ever receive from me." "But we are your family," she shrieked, the old entitlement flickering for one last, pathetic second. "You can't let your sister lose everything." "I already told you," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "I earned my own, and now you will have to do the same. I have already called security. You should leave before the police arrive to discuss the fraud charges Derek filed this morning. This isn't revenge, Tiffany. It is accounting." I turned my eyes back to my screen, which was filled with real contracts and real progress. I didn't look up when the guards arrived to escort her out. I simply went back to my work, finishing the chapter of my life they had tried to erase. The sun began to set over New Orleans, but for the first time, the shadows didn't feel like they were trying to swallow me. I stood in the center of the very first completed urban oxygen park, a former industrial wasteland that was now breathing. The air here was cool and smelled of damp earth and blooming jasmine. Around me, the massive green walls I had once been told were useless moss stretched toward the sky, filtering the city's heat and noise into something tranquil. This wasn't just a project. It was a living testament to the fact that you can grow something beautiful from the most neglected soil. The legal storm was finally subsiding. The Garden District mansion had been sold to a historical preservation society, and my parents were currently residing in a small rental in Nevada while they awaited their court dates for fraud and embezzlement. Haley's social media accounts had gone dark after the public realization that her perfect life was funded by siphoning money from a dying man. I didn't feel the need to check their updates or tally their losses. My old spreadsheet, the one where I tracked every dismissal and every debt, was gone. I had stared at the numbers one last time, felt the weight of their judgment lift, and hit delete. Grandpa John had been right. I saw patterns they missed. I saw that victory wasn't about having the loudest voice at the table or the most followers on a screen. It was about no longer auditioning for people who had already decided not to see me. I had stopped seeking validation from a source that was bone dry and started building my own reservoir. That night, for the first time in my life, I slept through until morning, without the ghost of a parent's disappointment haunting my dreams. No guilt, no noise, just the quiet conviction that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. To those of you listening who always feel like the extra person at the table, I want to say this to you directly. Being the unwanted child doesn't mean you are unworthy. It usually just means the people around you are too afraid or too small to handle the future you are building. You are allowed to stop making their morning coffee. You are allowed to walk away from rooms where your value is up for debate. You are allowed to build your own room with your own people who don't need to be convinced that you matter. Don't ever let someone define your worth by what they have in their wallet. If you found strength in Allison's journey, please hit that share button. You never know who else is standing on the edge, waiting for the courage to choose themselves. Thank you for being part of our community.